Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. The Michigan economy depends on a vibrant automotive sector. With the industry moving closer to electrification and foreign competition, particularly from China, intensifying, the race for the future is well underway. On today's episode, we'll talk to Sophia Schuster from the Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council and Glenn Stevens from MichAuto about what's at stake with Michigan's auto sector and the role of policy in setting up the industry for success. Here's your host, Senior Policy Analyst at Atlas Public Policy, Tom Taylor.
Hi there, and welcome to EV Hub Live. We're happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us. I have the honor of being joined today by Sophia and Glenn. As you know, we're in a period of tumult and a lot of uncertainty, and so they've promised to clear everything up over the next 30 minutes, which is great. So let's get started, and we'll start with some quick intros just to know where Sophia and Glenn are coming from. Sophia, I'll start with you. Can you just tell us who you are and where you're coming from?
Sure, and thanks for having us on the show, Tom. My name is Sophia Schuster. I am the policy principal for Michigan EIBC. I lead all of our transportation work. So EIBC generally is very focused on advocating for policy in the advanced energy economy across Michigan. But like I said, I primarily advocate in transportation, and lately that has had a lot more federal involvement than it did before. It was primarily more state before. So nice to be here.
Thanks, Sophia. And Glenn?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me. And hi, Sophia. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So I'm coming to you from downtown Detroit, right in the middle at Campus Martius, right at the city center. And I lead MichAuto. And MichAuto is the statewide auto and mobility industry association. And we work with all the different stakeholders, from the OEMs to startups to economic development and universities and community colleges, all around promoting, retaining, and growing the auto and mobility industry here in Michigan. We do advocacy work, primary Lansing, but as Sophia said, a lot more federal than probably we were used to or want to right now with tariffs. But we also work very heavily on the talent supply chain for the industry. So that's what I do.
Cool. Thank you. That's helpful. So we are in, this period of significant uncertainty, including and especially on two key fronts. One is tariffs, and then the other one is tax credits. Let's start with tariffs, and then we can zoom into what we're seeing in the US. But before we do that, Sophia, you just put out some analysis today, you and your team. Can you give us a really quick overview of what you found and what you were meaning to do with the analysis you put out?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for giving us a platform to talk about it. We are really excited about this report that focuses on the legacy of the automotive sector and how it has impacted the Michigan economy over the years, but in particular, what the EV transition has meant for Michigan. So I'm going to go into a whole bunch of details, as we continue to talk today. But that's the overview of the report. It was really precipitated by the work that we do with our over 160 members, and we wanted to make sure that we were advocating for them effectively at both the state and federal level. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm sure we're going to get into some of the things that you found in that analysis as we go through the conversation. But to start us off on tariffs, Glenn, we've seen a bunch of announcements, extensions, walkbacks on tariffs. There's a lot of noise in the space. Can you talk about the tariffs that we've seen so far that would most significantly affect Americans looking to buy an EV, and then what you're looking for next on the tariff front?
Well, I'll try to land this plane quick because it's been pretty complex since January 20th. That's when the president of the administration put out the America First trade policy. A pretty solid blueprint, pretty good overview of what was going to happen. But what we were very shocked and surprised with was the magnitude and velocity of what we've been dealing with. And so there have been a stack of tariffs, first on Canada and Mexico, with regards to border security, and no one would argue that border security and increasing manufacturing is a good or a bad thing. It's a good thing. So there was that. Then there was steel and aluminum, imported vehicles, imported components. Certainly China has been a threat all the way through that. So these tariffs have stacked. And in that, when you look at what is the supply chain from raw materials all the way really through the distribution and charging network, there are a lot of components that come from different places. They come from Canada, they come from Mexico. Raw materials come from all over the world to be processed. Electric motors, the different components of battery modules, because again, as most of your listeners know, we don't control that supply chain like we do the traditional internal combustion engine supply chain. That supply chain is very global. So there has been a lot of impact.
And Glenn, just on this one, in terms of next steps or what you're looking for next, are there sort of some key things that you're looking for or paying attention to over the next couple of months on tariffs?
Yeah, I guess I would summarize it by saying three quick things. Number one, there was an unstack of the tariffs just recently by the president, so that helps. There has been somewhat of a pressure relief on the tariffs themselves, but I think the ultimate is what we're driving towards and what we're communicating to the White House and our federal delegation is we really want to get back to a USMCA trade agreement that works. We believe our bloc, Canada, Mexico, and US as a whole is stronger, and that is really what we're advocating for.
Okay, that's helpful. And then Glenn, just to stick with you, because one of the stated goals from the administration around these tariffs is to support domestic manufacturing and the build out of a domestic supply chain. So what do you think, from a domestic policy perspective, what are the most important tools that the administration has to support that objective around domestic manufacturing?
Well, the tools that are in place right now or have been in place, and some of them been put on hold by executive order, but with regards to what emanated from the IRA, specific to vehicle tax credits for EVs, manufacturing credits, and incentives for EVs, and really that move to control our own technology. This is a long process. This is not something that can happen overnight. To bring it back to China, which I'm sure we'll talk about, they've been on about a 20-year process of developing an EV critical mineral and full supply chain, and that's what we're competing with. So that's the situation right now, and this is what we all have our focus on.
I think it's a good segue, Sophia, and we're going to put you on the spot here a little bit, but the House Ways and Means Committee have their markup booked in for tomorrow, and just this afternoon, within the last hour or so, we've seen the draft text from that committee. We've also seen draft text from other committees over the past couple of days. And so it's obviously too soon for you to be able to pass what those bill texts means, but what are some of the things that you'll be looking for on this front? What are some of the key policies that are in play and important to support both buyers of EVs, but also domestic supply chain, domestic manufacturing?
Yeah, there are a handful of tax credits that EV advocates are watching more closely. I think, in particular, we have the charging and fueling infrastructure tax credit, the clean vehicle tax credits, that's 30D, 45W, which is the commercial clean vehicle, and then 45X, which is the advanced manufacturing production tax credits. And those have had huge impacts in Michigan. As you said, Tom, we've had some of the text come out now. I haven't had an opportunity to really parse through it in detail, but based on our conversations with industry and advocacy partners, it's very likely that, and we've seen that a full retraction is being recommended in the initial text. We do expect, though, that this initial round is a lot of political grandstanding. I don't think legislators are going to shoot themselves enough in the foot to completely retract them now. We expect that those are going to get toned down in revisions, and those revisions could take a couple of different forms. maybe a reduction in the amount of the tax credit being offered. It could be that there's an implementation of a sunset where the tax credits are kind of phased out over time. Or we might see more stringent domestic manufacturing requirements, which might not be the worst thing, especially for manufacturers that are already reshoring their supply chain partners. So it's not really a question of if, it's a question of how much and what we can do with that. Ultimately, I think the message that we want to continue hammering home with the Trump administration is that these IRA tax credits have been absolutely essential to building out the US energy dominance that they have in mind. This is the mission. They've made it their priority. So stripping all of that away would absolutely undermine that mission and undercut a lot of local and statewide economic development. And that's going to particularly hit Republican districts. So those are the key messages that we would like to keep seeing, not only from industry advocates, but for businesses and policy folks as well, that they can continue to advocate for at the state and federal level.
And I think one of the pieces there you mentioned about shooting themselves in the foot. There's, in your analysis you put out today, there are some big jobs and investment numbers that you cite in Michigan. I wonder if you could just make clear what, the point that you make in that analysis about the extent of the economic opportunity in Michigan, and what those if you can give us any sense of what those projects look like in terms of, where are they under construction, how are they doing, how big are these projects? Just give us some color and movement, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 20% of Michigan's workforce is directly or indirectly supported by the mobility sector. So it's nothing to sneeze at by any means. In 2023 alone, the mobility sector contributed nearly $348 billion to the Michigan GDP. So again, that's all going to local and state economic development. Since 2016, so that's a lot of this is coming from IRA, but there was about $26.2 billion in private investment that has been announced in Michigan since 2016. The results of which could be 25,000 jobs or even more than that. I think what's really telling, though, is that about 75% of that private investment has gone to Republican districts. So if we do start to see the tax credits being repealed, or if we do start to see tariffs really taking an effect that would impact EV adoption, we are going to see declines in those areas, and they're going to be the most hard hit.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and that's one of the things we spend a long time tracking on the Clean Economy Tracker and EV Jobs Hub, is to track those projects. And one of the sort of interesting things is to see that projects are not just announcements on paper anymore, that they are under construction in communities, that they've opened in communities, that people are working at these facilities, and that they will keep doing so. And so, every day it's less abstract for communities in Michigan and across the country. These are, job centers and having impacts at the moment. Glenn, one of the key parts here is that it's really difficult to onshore a domestic supply chain, and it's really difficult to build a domestic supply chain, especially to rebuild a supply chain that has been impacted over the past couple of decades. So I wonder if you can talk about just how long it takes and the difficulties and sort of nuances of getting it right in order to build a supply chain, that it's not just a flick your fingers and it comes online, that it takes a long time.
Yeah, it's complex and it's global, and that's what's driven it. It's a global industry, and global platforms and architectures from the vehicle manufacturers, the desire for low cost, high quality components has made this be an evolution where components come from all over the world. Now, when we have an electric vehicle, which is now entering the market and growing in the market, we have a new supply chain, or a certain part of it, at least the propulsion system and a lot of the ancillary components are also imported. The problem with that is that there's a very large dependence on particularly Asia, particularly China, with regards to raw materials, processing, and the battery cell components. And we can't have that dependency. So we have to make a long-term investment to this too. Yes, the market and the consumer are going to drive adoption, but we really see this as a partnership between government, industry, and labor that are going to have to make this work. And to give you an example, to speak to your question about a nuance, and really what we're looking at is the fact that we only have one nickel mine open in the United States right now. And nickel has been designated a strategic mineral for aerospace, for electrification, for other things. And that one is in Michigan. It's in northern Michigan by my hometown, Marquette. We depend on Canada for a lot of it. And again, back to what I mentioned earlier about the USMCA agreement. So this is where we're at right now. And we have to get off that dependence, and we have to have strong trade partnerships with those countries and companies that can help us get our own dependence, particularly on the electric vehicle propulsion system.
Yeah, and I think, move back to you, Sophia. There's sort of some Michigan-specific history and context here that Michigan is unlike any other state in the country in terms of connectedness to Canadian industry, in terms of history of the auto sector, in terms of, in our tracking, Michigan and Georgia have seen the highest levels of EV and clean energy manufacturing investments announced. And so Michigan is pretty singular in terms of both the potential benefit and then potential risks from tariffs and tax credits. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of that history, and then how the impacts of tariffs and tax credits could impact Michigan specifically. That's sort of different to a national picture, but is quite particular to Michigan.
Yeah, of course. The history of the auto industry and Michigan are kind of intrinsically intertwined. You don't really talk about Ford and GM without talking about Michigan. And that was built on, as you said, Tom, a lot of really critical partnerships with Canada, with cities like Pittsburgh. And so I think, we want to see that trajectory continue. And as you said, Michigan has been the highest area of investment for EV manufacturing across the country compared to the rest of the states. And I think that's really telling, to invest in that history compared to other states where they might have lower cost labor and energy. And so we have manufacturers, GM, Ford, Stellantis, that are actively investing not only in Michigan, but in their legacy in Michigan. And so that is what is at stake. Since the election, Michigan has already seen a rescission of about $56 million in private investment. And so depending on the degree of the tax credit repeal, the tariff implementation, that is going to continue. We are going to see more than $56 million rescinded. And I think, to illustrate it, maybe people don't necessarily think about what the impact on a single vehicle is going to be. But, Ford and GM just a couple days ago announced the expected cost increases resulting from the tariffs. Ford said they were expecting $2.5 billion in cost increases. GM said $4 to $5 billion. And Ford was actually the first company to put a sticker impact on that. And it's about $2,000 for a couple of their models. If you take that and you add it to the potential repeal of the 30D tax credit, you're adding almost $10,000 onto the cost of the car. And that's going to result in reduced EV adoption. And as we've already kind of illustrated, EV adoption the EV transition has been incredibly important to the Michigan economy. If we start to see a decline in EV adoption, production is going to decrease, which means that there are going to be workforce layoffs. So the price is not just on the price of the vehicle, the cost is on the Michigan economy and on the Michigan workforce.
I think the point about 30D is very important, in part because that's one of the tax credits that's being discussed as at risk of repeal, or at least for significant cuts through this reconciliation bill process. So that's the clean vehicle tax credit for new vehicles, a $7,500 tax credit. And I think one core part of that tax credit is the specifications around the supply of battery components and critical minerals that encourages onshoring of production in the region, and then also encourages friendshoring of sourcing of critical minerals. And so if you get rid of that tax credit, or you really cut up that tax credit, the impact is felt double, both by the consumer but also by facilities that are trying to build these vehicles. And so we recently released some analysis on that exact topic to show the facilities and the kind of impact that we could see. Sophia, I think there's an important part of your analysis about where China and Europe are at. There's obviously a lot of discussion about these sort of peer regions and the kind of state of EV adoption in different parts of the world. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what it looks like in different parts of the world, and how the US sort of ranks or is competitive or not with these sort of key markets.
Yeah, I think, the US, I think it's really important to note that the US has made a lot of really great progress. Since in 2019, there were about 315,000 EVs sold, passenger EVs sold in the market. So it was only about 2% of vehicle sales. You fast forward 5 years, now there are 6 million EVs on the road. So it makes up about 10% of new sales. And that's, 370% sales increase over 5 years. So it's not bad, and it has definitely been enabled and accelerated by favorable policies like the clean vehicle and manufacturing tax credits in the IRA. It does, though, still pale in comparison to what we're seeing in Europe. So in the EU, EVs accounted for about 23% of new car registrations in 2023. As of 2025, EVs now make up about 15% of the vehicles on the road. And I think what's really interesting about Europe is that the European automakers are really doing quite well in their market. Just last week, Volkswagen announced that it more than doubled its sales in the first quarter year over year. So that's really encouraging. But at the same time, we are starting to see a lot more Chinese auto manufacturers come into Europe. So I guess if we kind of switch over to China now, there were 6 million EVs sold domestically in China in 2022, 8.1 million in 2023. That's a 25% increase in 1 year, and that's in the scale of millions, not thousands. So naturally, only so many people are buying cars. The domestic market in China is starting to slow down, so they are going to look to other markets, and they're looking now to Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. Europe, it's important to note, Europe does have tariffs in place for China, but they kind of vary based on the country and based on the manufacturer. But in April, BYD, which is the largest Chinese automaker of the 100 EV auto brands in the country, BYD sales in the United Kingdom increased 311%. We fully expect that is going to continue because they are starting, BYD in particular is moving some of its manufacturing into Hungary to get around those manufacturing tariffs. So like I said, we expect that trend is going to continue. And given the cost of manufacturing some of these Chinese vehicles, the tariff isn't always going to have a huge impact because of the higher willingness to pay in the United States and in Europe. So those are important facts to think about. the demand is there for EVs, and it's there globally. And, we see that it's growing very quickly. We know that the future of the industry is EVs, and it's the current direction and it's the future. So the question really is, who's going to lead that manufacturing? The country that leads EV manufacturing will lead the future of the automotive sector, and there's really no question about that.
I think that's really helpful just to situate things in that this is part of a bigger picture, a bigger story, and any slowdown in the US doesn't mean a slowdown globally, and therefore the US risks being less and less competitive in this sort of key market. I know we're about to wrap in a second, but if there are any questions from the audience, feel free to chuck them in the chat. But let me start with you, Glenn. Taking a step back, what's the impact on Michigan if decision makers in Washington, in this case, don't get the tariffs and tax credit calculus right? What does that mean for Michigan?
I don't want to think about what that means if we don't do that, and I'll tell you why. So I've been to BYD in Shenzhen, China. I've been there a couple times, and the first time I was there was about 12 years ago, and I was at their R&D center, and I looked at their vehicles, and I can tell you there wasn't much to write home about. The vehicle was very unsophisticated, but you could tell they were building something. Well, that company now is really dominating the globe, including in Mexico, by the way. And Sophia did a great job of laying this out. They build high quality, low cost, high tech vehicles where they have a completely vertically integrated supply chain. That's the global competition. And what that means for Michigan, to get back to your question, is, Sophia mentioned this too. I mean, we've been doing this for 120 years. 1901 in Detroit, 1904 in Windsor. These economies here are completely inextricably linked together. We have 12 assembly plants in Michigan. I get up in the morning wondering, how do I protect, retain, and grow those 12 assembly plants? And if we don't have the tools in place, again, government, industry, and labor working together, then I don't want to think about what that inflection point and how we could be a victim of it, because that means we have to figure out how to take the upward trajectory. That's what we need to do, and not be a victim of the downward trajectory. It's that serious.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, and the story of how these vehicles, like especially from BYD, but other automakers, are better in quality and better in sophistication year on year in terms of not just the vehicle, but the charging experience, the cost. These are all very impressive things, and it requires real intentionality, I think, from decision makers in the US to make sure that that US automakers keep up. Sophia, I will pass the same question to you. The question is, what's the impact on Michigan if decision makers don't get the tariff and tax credit calculus right?
Yeah, I should probably punt in the same way as Glenn did. I really don't want to speculate as to how catastrophic that could be. But I think the message that we want to leave with everybody is that, like EVs or not, you can drive an ICE vehicle and recognize the impact that the EVs and that the EV transition is going to have on not just the Michigan economy, but the national economy. So this is the future of the automotive sector. And if we are going to be competitive in this global market, we really need to continue supporting US automakers in navigating that transition. And that looks like continued supportive federal policies like the tax credits and potentially less volatile tariff language that is changing every day. But it also really highlights the importance of states. There are a lot of supportive and unsupportive state policies that we need to be on the lookout for, whether it's new budget items or new legislation that we're looking at. But really, we can't stress the importance of the state enough, because if we can't really count on the federal government to be consistent and supportive, we need to have state policies that are. So that's what I would like to just say about the future trajectory.
Nice. Well, thank you both for making the time to chat with me today and to share some of your thoughts. I know there is a lot going on, and trying to get across what all these things mean is really tricky. We will keep watching and keep sharing out what we're making of developments, and I'm sure that people can find you and follow you about the developments and your take on developments to come. But really appreciate your time, and also appreciate your time if you joined us today for EV Hub Live. But that's all, and thank you, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.